Welcome. This is 7.2, Feudalism and the Manor Economy. Medieval society was a network of mutual duties. Even kings and nobles exchanged vows of service and loyalty, and these vows were part of a new political and legal system called feudalism, which was the basis of European life during the Middle Ages. Feudalism was a structure of lords and lesser lords who were called vassals. Lords and their vassals exchanged pledges which were called a feudal contract. In this contract, lords expected military service, payments, and loyalty from vassals, and in return, they granted the vassals protection and bits of land called fiefs, or estates. By the 1100s, many nobles lived in castles which served as fortification. All aristocrats had a place in this structured society. For nobles, war was the way of life, and many trained from boyhood to become a knight. They learned to ride horseback, fight, care for weapons, and they competed in mock battles called tournaments. Noblewomen, too, participated in the warrior society. They took over the estates while their husbands were at war, and might even fight to defend their lands. A few learned how to read and write, but all were expected to learn how to spin and weave and to supervise servants. Knights were expected to follow a code of ideal conduct called chivalry. It required them to be brave and loyal and honest, to fight fairly and to treat captive knights well, and to protect the weak. Troubadours, who were wandering musicians, often sang about knights and ladies, and their songs formed a basis for medieval romances, or epic stories and poems. The manor, or lord's estate, was central to the feudal economy. Manors were self-sufficient, producing all of their people's needs. Most peasants on manors were serfs, who were bound to the land. Although they were not slaves, serfs could not leave the manor without permission. They had to work the lord's land several days a week and pay fees and get permission to marry. In return, they were allowed to farm several acres for themselves and to receive protection during war. Their work was very harsh, and hunger and disease were very common, yet they found times to celebrate such holidays as Christmas, Easter, and a lot of other Christian festivals each year. Feudalism developed in response to the need for protection. In the late Roman Empire and the early Middle Ages, there was the idea that might is right, and basically whoever was strongest would rule and would gain more power. So the peasants were the ones who got the pooey end of the stick, and they needed to figure out a way of survival, so they would put themselves under the protection of somebody who was stronger and had more power than they. And in return, they lost some of their liberty, and they had to start paying for the privilege of their safety. So feudalism ended up becoming a relationship between a stronger lord and his subordinate vassals. And the vassals, that same relationship was mirrored in the relationship between those vassals and the peasants. And vassals could have been peasants as well. Because lords often owned much more land than they could actually administrate, they would often divide their land between different vassals who would then owe that lord military service. So this dividing of land holdings gave them more opportunities to build up their military reserves, which is what feudalism is all about. Feudalism is basically a militaristic society. These vassals, in exchange for service, military service, would expect to get portions of land, which they called fiefs. And a fief could include several, at least 2 or 3 towns, or 1 or 2 or 3, and the land surrounding those towns, which would help to support what they called the manor. So the manor was the seat or the house of the local vassal that controlled that area. In the contractual ceremony, the vassal would in some way pledge his loyalty to the Lord. And this usually took place in a religious setting because the pledge was to be signified and solemnified by God himself. So the vassal was not supposed to break his pledge to the Lord. And then in return, he would often, well, the vassal would kneel before the Lord and sometimes even go all the way to the ground. And to symbolize his subjugation to the Lord could put his foot on the neck of the vassal just to show how much control he had over the vassal. And then the vassal would rise, and the Lord would often take a sword and touch the shoulders of that vassal. And this actually became immortalized in Hollywood when they used this symbolism to signify knights becoming knights. So you would be knighted by using the sword and touching each shoulder. Vassals, it depended on the lord, but some vassals were allowed to build castles. And a castle was of great importance to a vassal because eventually, if the vassal got strong enough, he could rebel against his lord, and the lord would not have the strength to overthrow him because of the castle. A castle could keep out invaders and give the vassal enough of leverage in order to manipulate the lord into giving more concessions. So the castles were important. And if you go to modern-day France today, you will not see very many castles, at least not ones with fortifications, because the French were some of the first to realize the need to get rid of as many castles as possible. And that happened in the 1500s when Cardinal Richelieu started to consolidate French power for Louis XIII. So castles, and in England also, castles were discouraged once the Norman conquest had happened in 1066. So castles, the place, if you want to go see truly medieval castles, the best place would be in Germany, which didn't unify under a single lord who could then enforce the tearing down of castles. So if you go to Germany, you'll see some of the most picturesque castles. In 700 AD, a new invention from China came over, and it was the stirrup. Before this, a mounted warrior could not keep his seat while he was fighting. He would often be pushed off. But with a stirrup, it unified him to the horse, and he was able to utilize the horse's power in his own fighting. And so it created a set or a class of warriors that were indispensable to the feudal system. So lords would often enlist as many cavalrymen as they could to try to bolster their military power. But the problem is that each mounted knight is very expensive. The cost of the horse and the armor is exorbitant, and so this caused them to have to enlist a new class of men that were not of noble birth, but were essential for their armies. And so this is where the knights came from. They were not originally of noble birth because they weren't involved in the governing of the territory. They were simply involved in the protection of the territory. So each knight, if you wanted to become a knight, you had to go through quite a rigorous training process. Young boys who wanted to become a knight usually had to start at the age of 6, and they would be included in the castle life as a page, first of all. And as a page, they would learn how to clean armor and table manners and court manners. That was their main function. They ran errands. Usually, sometimes they were too small to start true practicing of arms, but they could learn all the other parts of being a knight. And as time goes on, they would grow and develop the muscles that they needed to be able to start their training. And so they would train all the way until they became about the age of 13, all the way up until about 16, when they would then become a squire. And a squire would be able to go with his master, his knight, to the battlefield and be able to observe the battle. And if need be, he would have to go onto the battlefield to rescue his knight when he was wounded or thrown off of his horse and unable to get up. The armor was so heavy that oftentimes if a knight fell off of his horse, he would not be able to rise again. So the squire had to be brave enough to go into battle and strong enough to lift his master up and get him off of the battlefield. And then finally, after the battle was finished, he was in charge of cleaning up the very muddy and bloody and other kind of things, armor that the knight had been using. And finally, if he had been lucky enough to prove himself worthy of the title, he would have been knighted around between the age of 19 and 23. And this was a time when he could then gain all the rights and privileges of a knight, and he would then have his own page and own squire to work for him. But his job would then be to keep himself fit in case of battle or war, and to win honor and glory for himself and for his lord. And often when wars were not in session, they would hold something called tournaments, which were basically mock battles or competitions between warriors to try to see who was the bravest and who was the strongest and who was the most athletic or skilled. Because feudalism was based on militaristic ideals, women were not given as much freedom or as much prestige, but they were very useful to the manorial system. Because they were left behind when their men went to war or battle, they were often given the job of administrating the territory that their husbands or fathers had left behind. They were also very useful in as tools or pawns for brokering political alliances, and their marriages often brought with them land and wealth and prestige. The main job of women, however, in the Middle Ages was to have children. As a noblewoman, you would be expected to have quite a few children, as many as possible. Because of the constant warfare that was experienced in the early Middle Ages and the mid-Middle Ages, the church kind of stepped in and created some rules of appropriate conduct within battle. So certain times of year were not allowed to go to war, and if you were the winner or the loser, there were certain things that were taboo that the church created. And this system of laws or moral code was called chivalry. And chivalry was grudgingly accepted by this warrior class. But it was spread through the work of a group of traveling poets and minstrels called troubadours. The ideals of chivalry included being brave and loyal, honoring your word, fighting fairly, protecting the weak and women, and in general, leading a life that was above reproach in regards to your faith and your religion and your loyalty to your lord. The manorial system was created to support this militaristic lifestyle, and so knights would be given a fief, which would include an area of farmland and village to support the serfs who worked on that farmland. The lords of the manor were obligated to give serfs the use of land and for farming, but in return, the serfs were obligated to pay rent or money or labor to the lords for the use of that land. The lords had to protect the serfs from outside attack. One of the hallmarks of a manor was that it was self-sufficient. It needed to be self-sufficient because trade had kind of dwindled to a trickle by the Middle Ages, and everything that people needed had to be produced within their own little community. So this community would have to have a mill where they would be able to process the grain that they were growing and harvesting on the manor, and possibly a leather working industry and metallurgy industry, so that they could produce the plows and harvesting tools, as well as their the knights' needs for armor and horseshoes and etc. Though the manor was self-sufficient, it wasn't necessarily a comfortable living sometimes, especially if you were at the bottom of the feudal pyramid. So the peasants' lifestyles were often very, very poor. I liked this picture because it showed some of the things that might have been going on at that time. A serf's life was very, very limited. We like to say it was myopic because it was very enclosed and small vision oriented. So the serf would hardly have traveled very far, maybe a few miles at most. And most of them had no idea of the outside world. Their lives were very structured, mainly by the church and the holidays that they celebrated, and the year harvest cycle. And as a result, there was very little curiosity or growth or outward looking focus. One of the different ways of looking at the world between the Middle Ages and the modern time period is the way that we view the poor. Because in the Middle Ages, there was very little pity for poor people. The poor were poor, and they deserved what they got. And there was almost a feeling of fatalism, where they were poor because that was their fate. And so, for example, this can very vividly be seen in the way they punished crimes, because a poor person would have been punished much more severely than a lord who had committed the same crime. If a lord had committed murder, he would have been fined, but if a serf had committed murder, he would have been hung. And there were a lot of poor during this time period. People were basically focused on survival. They worked for very long hours and had very short lifespans. The average age was 35. They ate very simple foods, mostly bread and vegetables, very little protein, and they slept in huts with their livestock. Their livestock were actually essential to heating the homes. Not only were their body heat used to help heat the inside, but also the manure during the wintertime was stacked on the outside of the house on the side, and the methane emissions that the pile of dung created helped to heat the walls of the house during winter and keep the family from freezing to death.